Hi, my name's Elena Martinez, and this year my brother Marcus stole my revolutionary prosthetics design worth $2.3 million, presented it to investors as his own creation, and tried to have me committed to a psychiatric facility when I fought back. But that wasn't the worst part. He'd already been intercepting my patent correspondence for months, convinced our entire family I was having PTSD episodes, and when I finally proved the design was mine through military documentation, he made a podcast calling me an unstable veteran who couldn't handle civilian life. I never thought justice would look like a federal courtroom and a stammering confession on live television, but maybe that's what happens when betrayal wears the mask of brotherhood. Before we begin, what time is it where you are, and have you ever trusted someone so completely that their betrayal rewrote your understanding of reality? Tell me below, because this story doesn't end the way you think. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. It was a Tuesday morning in Phoenix when everything I thought I knew about my family crumbled like sand between my fingers. The Arizona sun was already brutal at 7 a.m., casting long shadows across the driveway of my small rental house in Ahwatukee. I'd been up since 0500 hours, old habits from my 8 years in the Army, working on what I called Project Liberation in my garage-turned-workshop. The smell of metal shavings and WD-40 had become my morning coffee, more familiar than the actual Ethiopian blend cooling in my mug on the workbench. My fingers traced the smooth curves of the prototype, a prosthetic leg unlike anything currently on the market. The design was elegant in its simplicity, revolutionary in its function. Where traditional prosthetics relied on basic mechanical joints, mine incorporated micro-hydraulics and pressure sensors that responded to the user's neural signals through surface electrodes. The wearer could feel texture, temperature, even the give of soft ground beneath their feet. After losing my left leg below the knee to an IED in Kandahar 3 years ago, I'd spent countless hours in VA rehabilitation centers, watching fellow veterans struggle with clunky, uncomfortable devices that felt more like punishment than assistance. The morning light streaming through the garage windows caught the titanium components I'd been assembling since dawn. Each piece had been machined to precise specifications, some parts so small they required magnification to install properly. The neural interface module, no bigger than a smartphone, contained code I'd written myself during late nights when phantom pain kept me awake anyway. Every line of programming represented hours of research into biomedical engineering, neural mapping, and adaptive algorithms. I'd documented everything meticulously. Military training had taught me the importance of proper documentation, and my engineering background at West Point had reinforced those habits. 3 leather-bound notebooks contained sketches dating back 18 months, each page signed and dated. Digital files on my encrypted hard drive showed the evolution of the design through hundreds of iterations. Even my bank statements told the story, tracking purchases of specialized components, software licenses, and machine shop time. The garage itself reflected this methodical approach. Pegboard walls displayed tools arranged by size and function. Component bins were labeled with both civilian and military part numbers. A whiteboard covered one entire wall, filled with biomechanical equations and stress calculations in my precise handwriting. Anyone walking into this space would immediately understand that serious engineering work happened here. My phone buzzed against the metal workbench, vibrating with an intensity that suggested multiple notifications. I glanced at the screen, expecting the usual morning updates from veteran support groups or technical forums. Instead, I saw 17 missed calls from my mother, 6 from my sister Carmen, and dozens of text messages. My stomach clenched with the familiar anxiety that had followed me home from Afghanistan, the hypervigilance that made unexpected communications feel like incoming mortars. The most recent message from Mom was time-stamped just minutes ago. "Elena, call me immediately. Marcus is on channel 15 right now. They're talking about your prosthetics thing." My workshop suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing closer as I fumbled for the remote control to the small television mounted in the corner. Channel 15's morning show flickered to life, showing the familiar news desk with hosts Brad Richardson and Melissa Chang. But it wasn't their faces that made my breath catch in my throat. Sitting in the guest chair, wearing his best navy suit and that practiced smile I remembered from our childhood, was my brother Marcus. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Local entrepreneur develops revolutionary prosthetics technology." "So Marcus," Melissa was saying, her voice bright with professional enthusiasm, "tell us about this incredible breakthrough you've developed." Marcus leaned forward slightly, hands clasped in what our mother used to call his serious business pose. "Well, Melissa, after seeing the struggles of our wounded veterans, I knew I had to do something. I've spent the last 2 years developing what I call the Liberation System, a prosthetic that actually allows amputees to feel sensation again." The remote control clattered to the concrete floor as my hand went slack. Liberation System. Those were my words. That was my name for the project. I'd chosen it specifically because I wanted veterans to feel liberated from the limitations of traditional prosthetics, free to live without constant awareness of their artificial limbs. On screen, Marcus was gesturing enthusiastically, describing technical specifications I'd spent months perfecting. He spoke about neural interface protocols, adaptive pressure responses, and haptic feedback systems, with the confidence of someone who'd developed them himself. Every word he uttered had been born in my garage, written in my notebooks, coded during my sleepless nights. "The most exciting part," Marcus continued, "is that we've already secured initial funding. 3 venture capital firms have expressed serious interest, and we're looking at a preliminary valuation of $2.3 million for the patent portfolio." Patent portfolio. My hands began to shake, not from the morning cold but from something deeper and more devastating. I'd filed preliminary patent applications 6 months ago, working with a patent attorney I'd found through veteran entrepreneurship resources. The paperwork had been submitted under my name, with my military identification and detailed technical drawings. How could Marcus claim ownership of something so clearly documented as mine? The television interview continued, but the words became background noise as my mind raced through possibilities. Marcus had always been charming, persuasive, the golden child who could talk his way out of any situation. Growing up, he'd convinced our parents that my broken window was actually caused by a neighborhood kid, that my missing homework was eaten by our dog, that my bruised arm from his too rough play was from falling off my bicycle. But this wasn't childhood mischief. This was theft on a scale I couldn't have imagined. Muck. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through recent calls, looking for any contact from Marcus. We'd spoken just 2 weeks ago, a casual conversation where I'd mentioned being close to a breakthrough with the prosthetics project. He'd seemed genuinely interested, asking technical questions about the neural interface and pressure sensitivity features. I'd been happy to share details with my brother, proud to have someone in the family who understood the significance of what I was building. The memory of that conversation now felt like swallowing glass. Every question he'd asked, every encouraging comment he'd made, had been intelligence gathering. While I'd been opening my heart about wanting to help fellow veterans, he'd been taking mental notes about marketable features and technical specifications. My laptop was already open on the workbench, password-protected files containing 2 years of development work. I navigated to the secure folder where I kept patent documentation, financial records, and legal correspondence. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, but something felt wrong. The timestamp on my main design file showed it had been accessed 3 days ago. I always shut down my computer completely each night, a security habit from my military service. Someone would have needed my password to access these files. Marcus had stayed over the previous weekend, claiming he wanted to spend time with his war hero sister and catch up on family news. I'd been touched by the gesture, especially since he'd brought takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant and listened patiently as I explained the prosthetics project. He'd even helped carry some heavy equipment boxes from my car to the garage, joking about how army training had made me stronger than him. I'd left him alone in the house Sunday morning, while I went to the VA for a routine appointment. My laptop had been in sleep mode on the kitchen table, not fully shut down like usual. At the time, I'd assumed I'd simply forgotten to power it off completely. Now I realized Marcus had never intended to bond with his sister. He'd come to steal my life's work. The garage felt stifling despite the morning coolness outside. I stepped into my small backyard, needing space to think clearly. The desert landscape stretched toward distant mountains, serene and unchanging in contrast to the chaos erupting in my life. 2 years of work, countless sleepless nights, every dollar of my disability payments invested in components and legal fees. All of it was being claimed by someone who couldn't tell a microprocessor from a pressure sensor. My phone rang again, Mom's name appearing on the screen. I answered on the fourth ring, my voice steadier than I felt. I saw the interview. "Elena, honey, I'm so confused," she said, her tone walking the careful line between concern and accusation. "Marcus says you've been having episodes again, that you think you invented something he's been working on for years. He's worried about you, sweetheart. He thinks the stress of civilian life might be affecting your memory." The words hit like a physical blow. Episodes. Memory problems. Stress of civilian life. Marcus had been laying groundwork for this conversation, planting seeds of doubt about my mental stability. In our family's eyes, I was the wounded veteran struggling with PTSD, while Marcus was the successful businessman looking out for his troubled sister. "Mom, I have documentation," I said, walking back toward the garage where my notebooks lay open on the workbench. Patents filed under my name, design sketches dated back 18 months, bank records showing component purchases. This isn't a memory problem or an episode. This is theft. There was a long pause before she responded, and when she did, her voice carried the patient tone reserved for unreasonable children. "Marcus showed us some of his early sketches too, honey. He's been working on prosthetics ideas since college, you know that. Maybe you both had similar thoughts, or maybe you saw some of his notes and forgot. The important thing is getting you the help you need. Getting me the help I need." The phrase echoed with the finality of a diagnosis, a family decision already made without my input. I was the problem to be managed, not the victim to be supported. Marcus had orchestrated this perfectly, using my own military service and visible disability against me. Who would believe the veteran with PTSD over the clean-cut businessman with no obvious mental health concerns? I ended the call without saying goodbye and stood in my garage surrounded by 2 years of meticulous work. Every tool, every component, every notebook page told the story of my innovation and dedication. But stories, I was learning, could be rewritten by people with better lawyers and more convincing smiles. The morning sun climbed higher, and somewhere across the city my brother was probably fielding congratulatory calls from investors and reporters. Meanwhile, I stood alone in my garage, holding the prototype that proved everything I claimed to be true, wondering how truth could feel so powerless against a well-constructed lie. The weeks following Marcus's television appearance felt like living in a carefully constructed alternate reality, where up was down and theft was innovation. My small rental house in Ahwatukee had become both a sanctuary and prison, the only place where the evidence of my work still spoke louder than my brother's lies. Each morning I'd wake to the desert sunrise streaming through my bedroom blinds, momentarily forgetting the nightmare my life had become, only to have reality crash back with the weight of a falling building. The garage workshop remained exactly as I'd left it that Tuesday morning. Tools arranged with military precision, notebooks open to pages of technical diagrams, the prototype sitting on the workbench like a monument to betrayal. I'd photographed everything from multiple angles, documenting each component, every handwritten note, each dated sketch. My engineering training and military background had taught me that evidence was only as good as its chain of custody, and I was determined to preserve every link. But preservation felt futile when the entire world seemed determined to rewrite history. Marcus had appeared on 3 more local news programs, each interview more polished than the last. He'd developed a compelling narrative about his inspiration coming from volunteering at VA hospitals, about late nights spent researching biomedical engineering, about the emotional journey of wanting to serve those who'd served our country. The story was beautiful, heartfelt, and completely fabricated. Lani, what disturbed me most wasn't just the lies themselves, but how easily everyone accepted them. Marcus had always possessed an uncanny ability to make people believe whatever version of reality suited him best. In high school, he'd convinced our parents that his failing grades were due to a learning disability rather than his refusal to study. In college, he'd somehow transformed academic probation into a story about professors who didn't understand his innovative thinking. Now he was performing the same magic on a much larger stage, and the audience was eating it up. The venture capital firms he'd mentioned were real. I'd spent hours researching Meridian Ventures, Tech Forward Capital, and Phoenix Innovation Fund, all legitimate investment groups with impressive portfolios. Their websites now featured brief mentions of an exciting new prosthetics technology, with professional headshots of Marcus looking confident and visionary. Seeing those photos felt like watching someone wear my clothes to a party I hadn't been invited to. My own attempts to contact these firms had been met with polite deflection. Receptionists took messages that were never returned. Email inquiries disappeared into digital voids. The few times I managed to speak with actual representatives, they seemed confused by my claims, as if I were a delusional stranger trying to insert myself into someone else's success story. When I mentioned having patent applications filed under my name, one investor's assistant actually laughed, suggesting I must be mistaken about the timeline. The legal implications were becoming clearer each day, and the picture they painted was terrifying. Marcus hadn't just stolen my idea. He'd systematically undermined my ability to prove ownership. The patent attorney I'd worked with, David Chen, had stopped returning my calls after the third day. When I finally reached his secretary, she informed me that Mr. Chen was no longer representing me due to, quote, 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 quote. The implication was obvious but impossible to prove. Marcus had somehow gotten to my own lawyer. My attempts to contact the patent office directly led me through a labyrinth of bureaucracy that seemed designed to discourage individual inventors. The preliminary applications I'd filed were still in the system, stamped with my name and military identification number, but accessing them required navigating automated phone systems and waiting periods that stretched into weeks. Meanwhile, Marcus was moving forward with investor meetings and production planning as if time was on his side. Family dinners had become elaborate theatrical productions, where I played the role of the troubled veteran while Marcus starred as the concerned brother. Our parents' house in North Phoenix, once a refuge from the harsh realities of post-military life, now felt like enemy territory. The dining room where we'd shared countless meals growing up had been transformed into a stage set for Marcus's performance of brotherly devotion. Last Sunday's dinner was particularly surreal. Mom had prepared my favorite meal, her famous green chile enchiladas with Spanish rice, and set the table with the good china reserved for special occasions. The gesture might have been touching if it hadn't felt so much like a farewell dinner for someone about to be shipped off to an institution. Elena's been having such a hard time adjusting, Marcus had said, cutting his enchilada with surgical precision. The transition from military to civilian life is so challenging for our veterans. I think the prosthetics project has become a kind of coping mechanism for her. Dad nodded gravely, his weathered hands folded on the table. 30 years as a construction foreman had taught him to value practical solutions over emotional complications. Maybe it's time to consider some professional help, Mija. There's no shame in getting support when you need it. Professional help. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. They weren't talking about business mentorship or legal advice. They meant psychiatric intervention, the kind that came with medical records and competency evaluations that could be used to invalidate patent claims and business contracts. Carmen, my younger sister, who'd always been the family mediator, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I just think we need to support Elena through this difficult time. Maybe the details about who invented what aren't as important as making sure she's okay. The details about who invented what? My life's work had been reduced to petty siblings squabbling over credit, as if I were a child claiming to have drawn a picture that obviously came from a coloring book. I'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan, earned a Bronze Star for Valor Under Fire, and completed an engineering degree while recovering from an amputation. Yet here I sat, being discussed like a mental patient who couldn't distinguish reality from delusion. I have documentation, I'd said quietly, the same words I'd been repeating for weeks. Patents filed under my name. Design notebooks with dated entries. Bank records showing component purchases. I can prove everything. Marcus had reached across the table to pat my hand with practiced sympathy. Elena, honey, I know you believe that. But sometimes trauma can affect our memory in ways we don't realize. I've been researching PTSD and its impact on cognitive function. It's actually very common for veterans to have gaps or confusion about timelines. The audacity was breathtaking. He was using my own service record, my own sacrifice, as evidence against me. The IED that had taken my leg had left no cognitive damage. I'd been thoroughly evaluated by military medical professionals before my discharge. But Marcus had found a way to weaponize my veteran status, turning my greatest source of pride into proof of my unreliability. After dinner, while Mom loaded the dishwasher and Dad dozed in his recliner, I'd cornered Carmen in the hallway outside our childhood bedrooms. The walls were still decorated with family photos spanning decades, school pictures, graduation ceremonies, military promotion ceremonies. My army portraits looked back at me from their frames, a younger version of myself in dress blues, confident and optimistic about the future. "You know I'm not crazy," I'd said to Carmen, keeping my voice low. "You know Marcus is lying." She'd glanced toward the kitchen, making sure we wouldn't be overheard. "Elena, I don't know what to think anymore. Marcus has been working on business ideas for years. Maybe you both had similar thoughts. Or maybe there's some misunderstanding about who developed what first." "There's no misunderstanding. He stole my work. He's been planning this for months, maybe longer." Carmen's expression had shifted from uncertainty to concern. "Honey, you're starting to sound paranoid. I know readjusting to civilian life is hard, but maybe you should consider talking to someone. There are therapists who specialize in veteran issues." Paranoid. The word followed me home that night, echoing in my mind as I sat in my garage workshop surrounded by the evidence of my sanity. Every tool, every component, every page of documentation proved that I wasn't delusional or confused. Yet somehow, the truth felt increasingly fragile against the weight of my family's manufactured concern. The isolation was the worst part. Military service had taught me the value of unit cohesion, of having teammates who watched your back regardless of circumstances. Civilian life offered no such loyalty, no code of honor, that prevented those closest to you from turning traitor. Marcus had managed to recruit our entire family as unwitting accomplices in his fraud, using their love for me as a weapon against my credibility. My veteran support group had tried to help, but their advice felt inadequate for the scope of Marcus's deception. "Family can be complicated," offered Jake Martinez, a Marine who'd lost both legs in Fallujah. "Sometimes the people who should support us the most are the ones who hurt us the worst." His words carried the weight of personal experience, but they offered no practical solutions for reclaiming stolen intellectual property. The workshop had become my command center, the only space where I could think clearly without the suffocating weight of my family's concerned gazes. I had installed a security camera system using my disability benefits, determined to prevent any further infiltration. The garage door now had 3 different locks, and I'd changed the entry codes on my laptop and phone. If Marcus wanted to steal more of my work, he'd have to break down doors to do it. Late at night, when the desert cooled and the neighbors' houses went dark, I'd sit at my workbench and methodically document everything I could remember about Marcus's recent behavior. The timing of his visits, the questions he'd asked, the way he'd volunteered to help with equipment moves. Each memory took on new significance when viewed through the lens of premeditated theft. The most chilling realization was how long he'd been planning this. His sudden interest in my prosthetics work hadn't begun 2 weeks ago during our fateful conversation. Looking back, I could trace his reconnaissance efforts back almost 6 months, to casual family gatherings where he'd asked seemingly innocent questions about my progress, my timeline, my funding sources. He'd been patient, methodical, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Now he was racing toward investor agreements and production contracts while I sat alone in my garage, surrounded by proof that might never see the inside of a courtroom. The truth was supposed to set you free, but sometimes the truth was just another kind of prison, one with walls built from other people's willingness to believe beautiful lies over uncomfortable realities. The first real warning sign arrived on a Thursday morning disguised as concern. I was testing the pressure sensitivity calibrations on my prosthetic prototype when the doorbell rang with an urgency that made my shoulders tense automatically. Through the peephole, I saw Dr. Sarah Whitman from the VA Medical Center, her clipboard clutched against her chest and her expression wearing that particular blend of professional sympathy and bureaucratic determination that veterans learn to fear. "Elena, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced," she said when I opened the door, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "I received some concerning calls about your well-being, and I wanted to check in personally." Concerning calls. The phrase hit my stomach like cold lead. I invited her in, my mind racing through possibilities while maintaining the calm exterior that military training had drilled into my bones. Dr. Whitman had been my psychiatrist for 2 years, helping me navigate the adjustment challenges that came with losing a limb in service to my country. Our sessions had always been productive and professional, focused on practical coping strategies rather than deep psychological excavation. She settled into my living room chair, the same spot where Marcus had sat just weeks earlier while gathering intelligence for his theft. The irony wasn't lost on me that both visits involved people I'd trusted using my own space to evaluate my mental state. "I understand you've been experiencing some difficulties with family relationships," Dr. Whitman began, consulting her notes with theatrical precision. "Specifically, there seems to be some confusion about intellectual property and business ventures. Confusion. Not theft, not fraud, not systematic deception. Confusion, as if I were an elderly patient mixing up medications rather than a combat veteran with an engineering degree documenting a clear case of intellectual property theft. Doctor, there's no confusion. My brother stole my prosthetics design and is presenting it to investors as his own work. I have extensive documentation proving the technology is mine." She nodded with the patience reserved for delusional patients. "Elena, I know this feels very real to you, but I've been in contact with your family, and they're quite worried. Your brother Marcus seems genuinely concerned about your mental health. He mentioned that you've been making accusations that don't align with documented timelines." The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing closer as I realized the scope of Marcus's manipulation. He hadn't just stolen my work, he'd preemptively attacked my credibility by painting me as an unstable veteran prone to paranoid delusions. Every family member he'd spoken to, every professional he'd contacted, had been fed the same narrative about my declining mental health. "What documented timelines?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. "I filed preliminary patent applications 6 months ago. My design notebooks go back 18 months. I have bank records showing component purchases dating back 2 years." Dr. Whitman flipped through her notes, her expression growing more concerned. "Marcus provided some documentation to your parents, showing his own development work stretching back to his college years. He's worried that your PTSD might be affecting your memory and perception of events." College years. Marcus had studied business administration with a minor in marketing. He'd taken exactly 1 engineering course in his entire academic career, dropping it after 3 weeks, when he realized it required actual mathematics. The idea that he'd been developing prosthetics technology during late-night fraternity parties was so absurd, it would have been laughable if it weren't being used to destroy my reputation. "Doctor, I served 3 tours in Afghanistan. I've been evaluated multiple times by military medical professionals. My cognitive function has never been questioned. This isn't PTSD or memory problems. This is a family member using my mental health history as a weapon against me." She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the gentle firmness of someone delivering bad news. "Elena, one of the hallmarks of certain psychological conditions is the inability to recognize their impact on our thinking. I'm not saying you're deliberately lying. I believe you genuinely think these events happened as you remember them." Genuinely think. The phrase hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning everything it touched. My service record, my engineering credentials, my meticulous documentation, all of it was being dismissed as the delusions of a damaged veteran who couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. "I can show you the documentation," I said, standing to retrieve my notebooks from the garage. "Physical evidence, dated entries, bank records, patent applications. Everything is verifiable." "Elena, please sit down. I've already reviewed some of the materials your family provided. What's concerning is how convinced you are that your version of events is accurate, despite evidence to the contrary." Evidence to the contrary. Marcus had been busy during the week since his television debut, apparently manufacturing his own paper trail to support his theft. I wondered what kinds of backdated documents he'd created, what stories he'd told to make his lies seem credible to outside observers. Dr. Whitman reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small digital recorder. "I'd like to record our conversation today. with your permission. Sometimes it helps patients hear their own words and recognize patterns they might not notice in the moment. The request felt like a trap, but refusing would only reinforce her concerns about my mental state. I nodded, watching her set the device on the coffee table between us like a small electronic judge. "Tell me about the prosthetics project," she said. "When did you first start working on it?" I walked her through the timeline, starting with my injury in Kandahar and the frustrating experience with traditional prosthetics during rehabilitation. I described the initial sketches, the research into neural interfaces, the nights spent coding adaptive algorithms while phantom pain kept me awake. Every detail was precise, chronological, and completely true. But as I spoke, I could see her expression shifting from professional interest to clinical concern. She was hearing my passion and precision as symptoms rather than evidence, my detailed recollections as obsessive fixation rather than proof of ownership. "The level of detail you're providing is quite remarkable," she said when I finished, "almost photographic in its precision." Another trap. If I provided specific details, I was being obsessive. If I spoke in generalities, I'd be vague and unconvincing. Marcus had created a no-win scenario where any response could be interpreted as evidence of mental instability. I document everything carefully. It's military training and engineering discipline. But Elena, your family is quite concerned about how much time you've been spending on this project. They say you've been working 18-hour days, isolating yourself from social activities, becoming increasingly paranoid about people stealing your ideas. Paranoid. There was that word again, following me like a curse. The fact that my paranoia had turned out to be completely justified seemed irrelevant to everyone determined to see me as mentally unstable. I've been working long hours because I believe in this technology. Veterans deserve better prosthetics than what's currently available. That's not paranoia, that's purpose. Dr. Whitman made a note on her pad, the pen scratching across paper with the sound of a verdict being written. "I'm going to recommend a temporary adjustment to your medication regimen. Sometimes PTSD can manifest in ways that affect our perception of reality, especially during times of stress. Medication adjustment. Code for chemical restraint, for drugging me into compliance while Marcus solidified his theft." I thought about the news stories I'd read about veterans being over-medicated by VA psychiatrists, their protests about side effects dismissed as resistance to treatment. I don't want medication changes. I want someone to investigate the intellectual property theft that's happening right now while we're sitting here talking about my mental health. Elena, I understand your frustration, but right now my primary concern is your well-being. Your family has asked about the possibility of a brief inpatient evaluation, just to make sure you're getting the support you need. Inpatient evaluation. The words hit like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my vision blur around the edges. They wanted to have me committed, locked away in a psychiatric facility where my protests about stolen technology would be dismissed as symptoms requiring treatment. You can't commit someone for disagreeing with their family about business matters. Of course not. But we can provide voluntary support when someone is experiencing difficulty distinguishing their perceptions from objective reality. Your family is very concerned about your isolation, your obsessive focus on this project, and your accusations against your brother. Voluntary support that would become involuntary if I refused. I'd seen enough military medical procedures to know how quickly voluntary could transform into medically necessary when convenient for the authorities involved. The recording device continued its silent observation, capturing every word for future evaluation by people who'd already decided I was mentally unstable. Marcus had orchestrated this perfectly, using my own mental health treatment as ammunition against me, while positioning himself as the concerned family member seeking help for his troubled sister. "I'd like you to leave now," I said, standing and moving toward the door. "If you have concerns about my mental health, document them through proper channels. But I'm not voluntarily submitting to evaluation based on my family's discomfort with my business disputes." Dr. Whitman gathered her materials with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to difficult patients. "Elena, I hope you'll reconsider. Your family loves you and wants to help. Sometimes accepting support is the bravest thing we can do." After she left, I sat in my living room staring at the spot where her recorder had been, understanding for the first time how thoroughly Marcus had outmaneuvered me. He hadn't just stolen my technology, he'd stolen my credibility, my family's trust, and now my freedom to fight back without being labeled mentally ill. The garage workshop felt different when I returned to it, less like a sanctuary, and more like evidence in a case being built against my sanity. Every notebook, every component, every carefully documented detail could be reinterpreted as the obsessive behavior of a veteran unable to cope with civilian life. But as I looked at my prosthetic prototype sitting on the workbench, I realized something important. Marcus could steal my design, manipulate my family, and weaponize my mental health history. But he couldn't steal the knowledge in my head, the skills in my hands, or the unshakable certainty that I was telling the truth. The war had shifted from intellectual property theft to a battle for my fundamental right to exist as a credible human being. And unlike the mountains of Afghanistan, this was a fight I refused to lose. The ambush came disguised as a celebration, wrapped in the familiar comfort of family tradition and seasoned with the kind of manufactured joy that makes your skin crawl. Carmen had called on a Saturday morning, her voice bright with artificial enthusiasm, inviting me to what she described as a small family gathering to celebrate Marcus's recent business success. The invitation felt like a summons, the kind you couldn't refuse without confirming everyone's worst suspicions about your mental state. "It's just going to be immediate family," she'd assured me, her tone walking the careful line between casual and coercive. "Mom's making her famous tamales, and Dad wants to hear more about Marcus's investor meetings. You should come, Elena. It would mean a lot to everyone if you were there to support your brother. Support your brother." The phrase tasted like copper pennies and broken glass, but I understood the subtext beneath Carmen's cheerful invitation. My absence would be interpreted as further evidence of my deteriorating mental health, more proof that I was becoming increasingly isolated and paranoid. Marcus had created a scenario where attending would be painful but not attending would be damaging to my credibility. I arrived at my parents' house in North Phoenix on Sunday afternoon, the desert heat shimmering off the asphalt like liquid metal. The familiar neighborhood looked exactly as it had throughout my childhood. Modest ranch homes with xeriscaped front yards, basketball hoops in driveways, and the occasional palm tree providing sparse shade. Nothing had changed except my understanding of the people who lived behind these comfortable facades. The front door was unlocked, family voices spilling out onto the porch, along with the aroma of masa and green chilies. I let myself in, military training automatically cataloging exits and sight lines even in my childhood home. The living room had been rearranged slightly, chairs positioned in a semicircle facing the large television where Marcus presumably planned to showcase his stolen success. "Elena!" Mom emerged from the kitchen wearing her favorite apron, the one decorated with roosters that Dad had bought her during a vacation to Santa Fe. Her embrace felt genuine but fragile, like she was hugging someone she wasn't sure she recognized anymore. "I'm so glad you came, Mija. Marcus was worried you might not feel up to it." Marcus was worried I might not feel up to it. Even my arrival was being filtered through his narrative about my declining mental health. I followed Mom into the kitchen, where Carmen was arranging tamales on a serving platter with the precise attention to detail she'd inherited from our grandmother. The kitchen smelled like childhood. Cumin and garlic, corn husks and simmering pork. The specific combination of spices that could transport me back to Sunday dinners when the world made sense. "How are you feeling, Elena?" Carmen asked without looking up from her arrangement, the question loaded with implications about my psychological state rather than genuine concern for my well-being. "You look tired." I looked tired because I'd spent the previous night documenting every piece of evidence I could gather about Marcus's theft, photographing notebook pages, and organizing financial records in preparation for whatever legal battle lay ahead. But saying that would only reinforce their collective belief that I was obsessively fixated on delusions about stolen intellectual property. "I'm fine," I said, reaching for a glass from the cabinet and filling it with water from the tap. The simple action felt like performance art, demonstrating my ability to function normally despite their concerns about my mental state. Dad wandered in from the living room, wearing his weekend uniform of khaki shorts and a polo shirt that had seen better decades. 30 years of construction work had left him with perpetually tanned forearms, and the kind of practical wisdom that valued solutions over complications. He'd always been proud of my military service, displaying my commendation certificates on the living room wall alongside Marcus's business school diploma and Carmen's nursing degree. "There's my soldier," he said, wrapping me in one of his bear hugs that smelled like aftershave and honest work. Marcus has been telling us about this prosthetics business. Sounds like something right up your alley. Right up my alley. The irony was so sharp it could have cut glass. Dad had no idea he was essentially saying that my stolen life's work seemed like something I might be interested in, as if Marcus's theft was a happy coincidence rather than calculated fraud. It's interesting technology, I managed, keeping my voice neutral while my chest tightened with suppressed rage. He's been working on it for years, apparently. Started in college, can you believe that? Always knew that boy had an entrepreneurial spirit. I started college. Marcus had been busy during the weeks since his television debut, apparently constructing an elaborate backstory for his theft. I wondered what kinds of documents he'd fabricated, what stories he'd told to make his lies seem credible to our parents who wanted so desperately to believe in their son's success. Marcus himself appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing a button-down shirt and slacks that suggested he'd come directly from somewhere important. His smile was perfect, the kind practiced in bathroom mirrors and refined through years of charm-offensive tactics. He looked like a successful entrepreneur, confident and visionary, while I stood there in jeans and a t-shirt looking exactly what they all believed me to be, a struggling veteran with mental health issues. "Elena, I'm so glad you could make it," he said, approaching with arms outstretched for a hug that felt like being embraced by a snake. "I know things have been tense between us lately, but family is family, right?" Family is family. The words carried an implicit threat. No matter what I believed about his theft, blood relationships superseded business disputes. He was reminding everyone present that I was accusing my own brother, someone who'd grown up in the same house and shared the same childhood memories. "Of course," I replied, accepting his embrace while every muscle in my body screamed to pull away. His cologne was expensive, probably purchased with advance money from investors who thought they were funding his original innovation. "Come on, let's all sit down," Mom said, ushering us toward the living room where she'd set up a buffet spread that could have fed twice our number. "Marcus has some exciting news to share about the business." Exciting news. I followed the family procession into the living room, taking a seat on the familiar couch where I'd spent countless hours doing homework and watching television during my teenage years. The room felt smaller now, cramped with the weight of unspoken tensions and manufactured enthusiasm. Marcus positioned himself near the television, remote control in hand, looking like a corporate presenter about to deliver a quarterly report. The coffee table had been cleared except for a stack of professional-looking documents, and what appeared to be a mock-up of product packaging featuring sleek graphics and the name Liberation Prosthetics in bold lettering. "I wanted to share this with family first," Marcus began, his voice carrying the confident cadence of someone accustomed to boardroom presentations. "We've just closed our Series A funding round. 3 venture capital firms have committed a total of $4.2 million for initial production and market development. $4.2 million. The number hit my stomach like a sledgehammer, representing not just the monetary value of my stolen work but the scale of Marcus's ambition. He wasn't just stealing my prototype. He was building an empire on the foundation of my innovation. Dad whistled low under his breath. $4 million? Son, that's incredible. The investors see huge potential in the prosthetics market, Marcus continued, clicking the remote to display a professionally designed presentation on the television screen. Current devices are primitive compared to what we've developed. Our neural interface technology represents a complete paradigm shift. Our neural interface technology. He said it so casually, as if we'd been partners rather than siblings, as if I'd been a collaborator rather than a victim. The presentation graphics were sophisticated, clearly created by expensive marketing professionals, using technical specifications stolen directly from my notebooks. Carmen leaned forward, studying the screen with genuine interest. "This is really amazing, Marcus. The technology sounds so advanced." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The breakthrough was developing microhydraulics that respond to neural signals, Marcus explained, gesturing at diagrams that showed cross-sections of my prosthetic design. Traditional prosthetics are basically mechanical tools. Our system actually allows amputees to feel sensation again, texture, temperature, pressure feedback. Every word he spoke had been born in my garage workshop, written in my notebooks, coded during my sleepless nights. He was reciting my life's work with the fluency of someone who'd lived every moment of its development, but the only thing he'd developed was an elaborate theft scheme. "Elena, you must be so proud of your brother," Mom said, turning to me with expectant eyes. "This is exactly the kind of innovation that could help veterans like yourself." Veterans like myself. The phrase was loaded with implication. I was the disabled veteran who would benefit from Marcus's generous innovation, not the engineer who'd actually created the technology. My own family saw me as a potential customer, rather than the inventor. "It's remarkable technology," I said carefully, aware that every word was being evaluated for signs of instability or jealousy. Neural interface programming must have taken years to develop. Marcus's smile didn't waver, but something flickered behind his eyes. Actually, the coding was the easy part. The real challenge was integrating all the mechanical components with the electronic systems. Lots of late nights troubleshooting calibration issues. He was describing my exact experience with casual expertise, as if he'd personally lived through every frustrating hour I'd spent perfecting the pressure sensitivity algorithms. The audacity was breathtaking. He was using my own memories as evidence of his innovation. "I'd love to see some of your early prototypes," I said, keeping my voice conversational despite the rage building in my chest. The development process must have been fascinating. For just a moment, Marcus hesitated. "Well, most of the early work was theoretical. Lots of sketches and computer modeling before we built actual hardware." Computer modeling. I knew exactly what software would be required for the kind of biomechanical analysis necessary to design neural interface prosthetics. Marcus had used Microsoft Office throughout college and probably couldn't distinguish CAD programming from web browsing. "Which modeling software did you use?" I asked innocently. I've always been curious about the technical side of product development. The question hung in the air like smoke, and I watched Marcus's expression shift almost imperceptibly. He was trapped between maintaining his expertise and avoiding specific technical details that would expose his ignorance. "We worked with several different platforms," he said vaguely. "The important thing was getting the right team together. Innovation happens when you bring the right people to the table." The right people to the table. He was already distancing himself from the technical development, preparing to credit unnamed team members for any expertise he couldn't demonstrate. But the damage was done. Everyone in the room had heard me ask technical questions that any real inventor would have answered with enthusiasm and specificity. The remainder of the presentation felt like an endurance test, watching Marcus display my stolen innovations while our family applauded his fictional success. Each slide showing my prosthetic designs, each chart displaying market projections for my technology, each photo of professional prototypes built from my specifications felt like watching someone else live my life. When he finally clicked off the presentation, the room erupted in congratulations and questions about production timelines and market launch dates. Marcus fielded inquiries with the smooth confidence of someone who'd rehearsed his responses, but I noticed he kept the technical discussions general, focusing on business strategy rather than engineering details. "Elena, what do you think?" Carmen asked suddenly, turning the spotlight onto me with the enthusiasm of someone genuinely excited about family success. "You must have insights about this kind of technology." Every eye in the room focused on me, waiting for my response. I could feel the weight of their expectations. They wanted me to celebrate Marcus's achievement, to play the role of the proud sister supporting her brother's entrepreneurial success. Anything less would be interpreted as jealousy or mental instability. "I think," I said slowly, choosing each word with surgical precision, "that whoever developed this technology is genuinely brilliant. The neural interface design is sophisticated, and the pressure feedback algorithms are remarkably advanced. This level of innovation doesn't happen overnight." It was the truth, carefully phrased to avoid direct accusation while planting seeds of doubt about Marcus's timeline. I watched his face for any sign of discomfort, but his smile remained fixed in place, like a mask he couldn't remove. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced normalcy, family conversation that skirted around the enormous elephant in the room. But something had shifted during my technical questioning, a small crack in Marcus's perfect facade that I planned to widen until the whole structure came crashing down. The breaking point arrived not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the slow-motion horror of watching my own life dissolve in real time. It was a Wednesday morning when I discovered that Marcus hadn't just stolen my design. He'd systematically dismantled every foundation of my existence with the methodical precision of a demolition expert. The call came from my bank at 6:47 a.m., jarring me from the few hours of sleep I'd managed between nightmares about courtrooms and psychiatric evaluations. Ms. Martinez, this is David Chen from First National Bank. I'm calling about some unusual activity on your business development account. We've received a request to freeze assets pending a competency evaluation. Could you come in today to discuss this matter? Competency evaluation. The words hit my nervous system like an electric shock, flooding my bloodstream with the hypervigilance that had kept me alive in Afghanistan, but now felt like poison in civilian life. I'd been expecting another move from Marcus, but the sophistication of this attack caught me completely off guard. He wasn't just stealing my intellectual property. He was using the legal system to declare me mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs. I drove to the bank through Phoenix morning traffic that felt like swimming through molasses, every red light an eternity of imagining worst-case scenarios. The First National Building squatted in downtown Phoenix like a concrete monument to institutional power, its glass facade reflecting the desert sun in ways that made my eyes water. Inside, the air conditioning was set to Arctic levels, presumably to keep customers alert during financial discussions that could reshape their lives. David Chen turned out to be a middle-aged man, with prematurely gray hair, and the kind of practiced sympathy that bank employees deploy when delivering bad news. His office was decorated with the usual corporate motivational posters and family photos that suggested he understood the importance of financial security. He gestured for me to sit in the chair across from his desk, then opened a manila folder with my name written in block letters across the tab. Ms. Martinez, I want to be upfront with you about the situation. We've received documentation from a psychiatric professional questioning your current capacity to make financial decisions. There are also concerns from family members about potential fraud or exploitation related to your business ventures. Fraud or exploitation. Marcus had managed to flip the narrative completely, transforming himself from perpetrator to concerned family member protecting a vulnerable veteran from financial predators. I wondered what kinds of documents Dr. Whitman had provided, what professional recommendations she'd made based on our single conversation about my mental health. What specific documentation? I asked, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. I haven't been declared incompetent by any court, and I haven't consented to any financial restrictions. Chen flipped through the papers in my file, his expression growing more uncomfortable with each page. There's a letter from Dr. Sarah Whitman at the VA Medical Center expressing concerns about your judgment and decision-making capacity. She mentions obsessive behavior related to intellectual property claims and potential paranoid ideation. Obsessive behavior and paranoid ideation. My careful documentation of Marcus's theft had been reframed as symptoms of mental illness, evidence that I couldn't be trusted to manage my own money. Every notebook page, every photographed component, every meticulously organized file had been transformed from proof of my competence into evidence of my instability. Additionally, Chen continued, your brother Marcus Martinez has filed a formal complaint alleging that you've been making false claims about owning technology that belongs to his company. He's provided documentation showing his development timeline stretching back several years. Marcus had been busy manufacturing a paper trail, creating backdated documents and false timelines to support his theft. I thought about the venture capital firms already committed to his project, the professional presentations using my stolen designs, the entire business infrastructure built on the foundation of my innovation. I'd like to see this documentation, I said, extending my hand toward the folder. I have a right to review any materials being used to question my competency. Chen hesitated, then slid several pages across his desk. The first document was Dr. Whitman's letter, written on official VA letterhead and filled with clinical language about my deteriorating mental state and inability to distinguish fantasy from reality. She recommended immediate psychiatric evaluation and suggested that my financial affairs be supervised until my condition stabilized. The second document made my blood turn to ice water. It was a business registration form for Liberation Prosthetics LLC, filed 3 years ago, and listing Marcus Martinez as founder and CEO. The filing date predated my first preliminary patent application by 18 months, creating the illusion that Marcus had been developing prosthetics technology long before I'd even begun my project. But I knew this document was a fabrication. 3 years ago, Marcus had been working as a junior marketing coordinator for a pharmaceutical company, complaining constantly about his boring job and his inability to afford the luxury car he wanted. He'd shown no interest in medical technology, engineering innovation, or helping disabled veterans. His sudden transformation into a visionary entrepreneur was pure fiction, but fiction supported by what appeared to be official documentation. The third page was even more devastating. A notarized statement from our parents expressing concern about my mental health and requesting that my financial accounts be monitored for signs of poor judgment. Mom and Dad had signed a document declaring me mentally incompetent, based entirely on Marcus's manipulation and Dr. Whitman's professional recommendation. "This is fraud," I said quietly, staring at my parents' signatures on the competency petition. "These business registration documents are backdated, and the psychiatric evaluation is based on false information provided by my brother." Chen's expression shifted from sympathy to the careful neutrality that bank employees adopt when dealing with potentially unstable customers. "Ms. Martinez, I understand this is distressing, but we have to take these concerns seriously. The bank has a responsibility to protect customers who may be vulnerable to exploitation." Vulnerable to exploitation. The phrase was perfect. Technically accurate, but completely inverted. I was indeed vulnerable to exploitation, but the threat came from my own family rather than outside predators. Marcus had weaponized the banking system's protective mechanisms, using their legitimate concern for customer welfare as a tool to freeze my assets and limit my ability to fight back. "What exactly does this mean for my accounts?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "All business-related transactions will require additional verification. Large withdrawals will be flagged for review, and any attempts to transfer funds for legal fees or business investments will trigger an automatic hold pending psychiatric clearance." Legal fees. Marcus had anticipated my next move, recognizing that my only hope of proving the theft lay in hiring competent legal representation. By freezing my assets, he'd effectively crippled my ability to mount a defense while he continued building his empire on my stolen foundation. I left the bank feeling like I'd been hollowed out with a rusty spoon, my insides scooped away and replaced with something cold and brittle. The Phoenix heat hit me like a wall as I exited the air-conditioned building, but even the desert sun couldn't warm the chill that had settled into my bones. Marcus hadn't just stolen my technology, he'd stolen my family, my credibility, my financial freedom, and my right to exist as a functioning adult in society. The drive home passed in a blur of rage and disbelief. Every traffic light, every stop sign, every mundane detail of suburban Phoenix life felt surreal against the backdrop of my collapsing existence. I'd survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, earned a Bronze Star for valor under fire, and completed an engineering degree while learning to walk again with a prosthetic leg. But none of that experience had prepared me for this kind of warfare, the slow-motion assassination of character and competence carried out by someone who shared my DNA. Back in my garage workshop, I stood among the evidence of my innovation and tried to process the magnitude of Marcus's attack. Every tool, every component, every notebook page that proved my ownership had been transformed into evidence of my mental instability. My careful documentation, which should have been my strongest defense, was now being used as proof that I was obsessively fixated on delusions about stolen intellectual property. The prototype prosthetic sat on my workbench like an accusation, its titanium components gleaming under the fluorescent lights. I'd poured 2 years of my life into this device, working 18-hour days while dealing with phantom pain and PTSD symptoms. Every circuit, every line of code, every mechanical adjustment represented months of dedicated effort to create something that could genuinely help fellow veterans. Now Marcus was claiming credit for this innovation while simultaneously destroying my ability to prove ownership. He'd created a perfect paradox. The more evidence I presented about my work, the more obsessive and delusional I appeared to outside observers. My technical expertise was being reframed as fixation, my detailed documentation as symptom rather than proof. I opened my laptop and began researching the business registration document that Marcus had apparently filed 3 years ago. The Arizona Corporation Commission website allowed public searches of business filings, and I wanted to examine the original documentation for any signs of forgery or backdating. If I could prove that his LLC registration was fraudulent, I might be able to unravel his entire scheme. But the search results showed that Liberation Prosthetics LLC had indeed been registered 3 years ago, complete with filing fees paid and annual reports submitted on schedule. Either Marcus had been planning this theft for far longer than I'd imagined, or he'd found a way to insert fraudulent documents into the official state database. Both possibilities were terrifying in their implications about the scope of his deception. My phone buzzed with a text message from Carmen. "Elena, we need to talk. Can you come over tonight? I found something in Mom's attic that you need to see." Something in Mom's attic. The message felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in bureaucratic quicksand. Carmen had always been the most perceptive member of our family, the one who noticed details that others overlooked. If she'd found evidence that contradicted Marcus's timeline, it might be enough to start unraveling his carefully constructed lies. But I also knew this could be another trap, another staged intervention designed to demonstrate my deteriorating mental state. Marcus had proven himself capable of orchestrating elaborate deceptions involving multiple family members. Carmen's invitation might be genuine concern, or it might be the next scene in his ongoing performance of brotherly worry about his unstable sister. I looked around my garage workshop one more time, taking in the organized chaos of components and documentation that represented my life's work. Tomorrow I would begin the process of fighting back, of proving that the truth was stronger than even the most sophisticated lies. But tonight, I would sit in my fortress of evidence and prepare for a war that would determine whether justice existed for veterans who dared to trust their own families. The desert sunset painted the garage windows in shades of amber and crimson, beautiful and harsh like everything else in this landscape I'd chosen as home after leaving the military. Somewhere across the city, Marcus was probably celebrating another successful day of building his empire on my stolen foundation. But he'd made one crucial mistake in his elaborate scheme. He'd underestimated the resilience of a combat veteran who'd learned that survival sometimes meant fighting battles that seemed impossible to win. The war for my life's work was just beginning, and I had no intention of surrendering without making him pay for every inch of ground he'd stolen. Carmen's house sat in a quiet cul-de-sac in Tempe, the kind of suburban neighborhood where young families planted desert willows and installed playsets in xeriscaped backyards. I'd helped her move into this place 2 years ago, carrying boxes, while she directed traffic with the efficiency of someone who'd inherited our mother's organizational skills. Now I sat in my car outside her front door, engine off but hands still gripping the steering wheel, trying to decide if walking through that door would be salvation or another carefully orchestrated trap. The text message had been brief but urgent, carrying an undertone that felt different from the concerned family interventions I'd endured over the past weeks. Carmen had always been the neutral party in family conflicts, the diplomat who smoothed over tensions between Marcus's ambition and my stubborn independence. If she'd found something in Mom's attic that contradicted Marcus's narrative, it might be the evidence I desperately needed to prove my sanity and reclaim my stolen work. But trust had become a luxury I could no longer afford. Marcus had demonstrated a remarkable ability to recruit family members as unwitting accomplices in his schemes, using their love and concern as weapons against my credibility. Every conversation, every family gathering, every expression of worry about my mental health had been transformed into ammunition for his campaign to paint me as an unstable veteran prone to paranoid delusions. I finally forced myself out of the car and walked up the pathway lined with decorative gravel and small cacti. Carmen answered the door before I could knock, her expression carrying a mixture of excitement and apprehension that reminded me of childhood secrets shared behind closed bedroom doors. She'd always been the keeper of family mysteries, the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries that everyone else forgot, who organized photo albums and preserved mementos that others would have discarded. "Elena, thank God you came," she said. pulling me inside with an urgency that felt genuine. "I've been going through Mom's storage boxes, helping her organize for the move to the senior community. You need to see what I found." The move to the senior community was news to me, another family decision made without consulting the daughter, whose mental competence was apparently in question. But I pushed aside the hurt and focused on Carmen's words, the promise of evidence that might finally validate my version of events. Her living room had been transformed into an archaeological expedition. Cardboard boxes stacked on every available surface and labeled with decades of family history. Photo albums lay open on the coffee table, displaying forgotten moments from our childhood when Marcus and I had been allies rather than adversaries. But it wasn't nostalgia that had prompted Carmen's urgent summons. It was the manila envelope she held in her trembling hands. "I found this in a box marked Marcus College Years," she said, offering me the envelope with the solemnity of someone presenting evidence at a murder trial. "Mom kept everything: report cards, acceptance letters, even his old class schedules. This was tucked inside his senior year transcript folder." The envelope was yellowed with age and sealed with tape that had lost its adhesive power years ago. Inside were 3 sheets of paper that made my breath catch in my throat. The first was a college career counseling form filled out in Marcus's distinctive handwriting, dated 6 years ago, during his senior year at Arizona State University. Under career interests, he'd listed marketing, advertising, and sports management. Under fields to avoid, he'd written in clear block letters: engineering, medicine, anything requiring math. Anything requiring math. The prosthetics technology he was claiming as his invention required advanced mathematics, biomechanical calculations, neural signal processing algorithms, pressure distribution formulas that would have been incomprehensible to someone who actively avoided mathematical concepts. This single line demolished his carefully constructed timeline about developing medical technology during his college years. The second document was even more damaging, a transcript from his attempt at an introductory engineering course during his junior year. The official grade listing showed that Marcus had withdrawn from Introduction to Biomedical Engineering after just 2 weeks, citing the course as too technical for my career goals. The irony was devastating. He'd literally run away from the same field he was now claiming to have mastered through years of dedicated study. But it was the third document that made my hands shake with a combination of rage and vindication. It was a letter Marcus had written to the financial aid office, requesting emergency funds to cover living expenses after a failed business venture. The date was 18 months ago, exactly when he claimed to have been developing his prosthetics innovation. Instead of working on revolutionary medical technology, he'd been begging for grocery money after investing his savings in a cryptocurrency scheme that had collapsed spectacularly. "Carmen," I whispered, staring at the documents that proved beyond any doubt that Marcus's entire timeline was fabricated. "Do you understand what this means?" She nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I've been thinking about it all day. Marcus couldn't have been developing prosthetics technology during college because he hated engineering. And he couldn't have been working on it 18 months ago because he was broke and desperate for financial aid. The relief that flooded through my system was so intense it made me dizzy. For weeks I'd been gaslighted by my own family, told that my memories were unreliable, and my documentation was the product of mental instability. But here was irrefutable proof that Marcus's story was a complete fabrication, evidence so clear that even the most determined apologist couldn't explain it away. "There's more," Carmen continued, reaching for another box labeled with our mother's careful script. "I found some of your old stuff, too. Things from when you first came home from Afghanistan." She pulled out a familiar notebook, one I'd forgotten existed. It was a small composition book I'd used during my first months of rehabilitation, when walking with a prosthetic felt like learning to balance on a tightrope while juggling. The pages were filled with sketches and observations about the limitations of existing prosthetic technology, ideas for improvements scribbled during long nights when phantom pain kept me awake. The dates on these early sketches predated Marcus's business registration by more than a year, providing a clear timeline of my innovation that couldn't be disputed or backdated. Every page was signed and dated in my handwriting, with detailed observations about pressure points, balance issues, and the desperate need for sensory feedback in prosthetic devices. "I remember this," I said, flipping through pages that documented the beginning of my journey toward creating better prosthetics. I started thinking about improvements almost immediately after getting my first prosthetic. The standard devices were so primitive, so uncomfortable. Carmen leaned over to examine the sketches, her finger tracing the evolution of ideas that would eventually become my revolutionary design. "Look at this one," she said, pointing to a drawing labeled Neural Interface Concept, January 2022. This is basically the same technology Marcus is claiming he invented. The evidence was overwhelming, a paper trail that demolished every aspect of Marcus's fabricated timeline. He couldn't have been developing prosthetics during college because he'd actively avoided engineering courses. He couldn't have been working on the technology 18 months ago because he'd been financially desperate and begging for aid. And my own documentation proved that I'd been conceptualizing these innovations since my early days of rehabilitation, years before Marcus claimed to have begun his research. "Carmen, we have to take this to the authorities," I said, carefully organizing the documents into chronological order. "This proves that Marcus committed fraud, that he stole my intellectual property, and created false documentation to support his theft." But even as I spoke the words, I knew the battle would be far from simple. Marcus had already poisoned the well of family opinion, convincing our parents that I was mentally unstable and prone to paranoid accusations. Dr. Whitman had provided professional documentation questioning my competency, and the banking system had already flagged my accounts as potentially problematic. "Elena, I'm scared," Carmen admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "If Marcus has been lying about this, what else has he lied about? And why would he do this to his own sister?" The answer to her question was something I'd been avoiding, a truth too painful to acknowledge even to myself. Marcus hadn't stolen my technology because he needed money, or because he stumbled across an opportunity. He'd done it because he fundamentally believed that his success mattered more than my welfare, that his reputation was worth more than my sanity, that his future was more valuable than my life's work. We spent the next hour organizing the evidence, creating a timeline that clearly demonstrated the progression of my innovation and the impossibility of Marcus's claims. Carmen photographed every document with her phone, creating digital backups that couldn't be lost or destroyed. The physical evidence would need to be preserved carefully, protected from any attempt at tampering or theft. As we worked, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. Not the desperate optimism of someone grasping at straws, but the solid confidence of someone who finally possessed the tools necessary to fight back effectively. Marcus had been clever, manipulative, and ruthless in his theft. But he'd also been arrogant, assuming that his charm and fake documentation would be enough to overcome any challenge to his story. He hadn't counted on Carmen's methodical preservation of family history, her habit of keeping every document and organizing every detail. His own academic records had become the evidence that would destroy his carefully constructed lies, proof that the golden child of the family was nothing more than a sophisticated fraud. The war for my intellectual property and my sanity was about to enter a new phase, one where truth would finally have the ammunition necessary to defeat even the most elaborate deception. The trap revealed itself with the precision of a military operation, complete with staging that would have impressed theater directors and timing that suggested weeks of careful planning. The call came from Mom on Thursday morning, her voice carrying that particular blend of maternal concern and forced cheerfulness that I'd learned to recognize as danger wrapped in familial obligation. "Elena, sweetheart, we need to talk as a family. Can you come by the house this evening? Nothing formal, just us. Marcus has some ideas about how we can work through this situation together." Marcus has some ideas. The phrase sent ice water through my veins, but I knew refusing would only reinforce their narrative about my deteriorating mental state and unwillingness to accept help. The evidence Carmen and I had discovered would mean nothing if I appeared to be avoiding reasonable family discussions about resolution. I arrived at my parents' house just as the desert sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reminded me of sunsets in Kandahar. The familiar neighborhood looked peaceful in the golden light, but something felt wrong about the carefully arranged normalcy. Too many cars in the driveway, including a silver sedan I didn't recognize, parked behind Marcus's BMW. The front door opened before I could knock, revealing Marcus in his best approximation of casual concern. Expensive jeans paired with a button-down shirt that probably cost more than my monthly disability check. His smile was perfect, practiced, the expression of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in bathroom mirrors. "Elena, I'm so glad you came," he said, his voice pitched for the benefit of unseen observers. "I know things have been difficult between us, but I want to find a way forward that works for everyone." The living room had been transformed into something resembling a therapeutic intervention, with chairs arranged in a circle and tissues strategically placed on side tables. Mom and Dad sat together on the couch, their expressions grave with the weight of parental responsibility. Carmen occupied the chair nearest the hallway, her position suggesting either moral support or strategic positioning for a quick exit. But it was the presence of Dr. Whitman that confirmed my worst suspicions about this gathering. She sat in the chair typically reserved for honored guests, her professional clipboard balanced on her lap, and her expression radiating clinical concern. The staging was perfect. A troubled veteran surrounded by loving family members and a qualified professional, all working together to address her psychological crisis. "Elena, please sit down," Dr. Whitman said, gesturing toward the single empty chair positioned directly across from her own. "Your family asked me to be here because they're concerned about your well-being and your recent accusations against Marcus." Recent accusations? Not theft, not fraud, not intellectual property violations. Accusations. As if my documented proof of Marcus's deception was nothing more than the paranoid ramblings of a mentally unstable veteran who couldn't distinguish reality from delusion. "This feels like an ambush," I said, remaining standing despite their expectations. "If this is supposed to be a family discussion, why is my psychiatrist here taking notes?" Marcus stepped forward, his expression radiating brotherly concern. "Elena, we're all worried about you. The accusations you've been making, the isolation, the obsessive focus on this prosthetics project, these aren't the actions of someone who's thinking clearly." Obsessive focus. He was using my dedication to innovation, my pride in creating technology that could help fellow veterans, as evidence of mental instability. Every hour I'd spent perfecting the neural interface, every night I'd worked on pressure sensitivity algorithms, was being reframed as symptoms of psychological deterioration. "I have documentation proving that you stole my technology," I said, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. "Carmen found your college transcripts showing that you withdrew from engineering courses and actively avoided mathematical subjects." The room fell silent for a moment, and I watched Marcus's expression flicker with something that might have been panic before settling back into practiced concern. But Dr. Whitman leaned forward, her pen already moving across her notepad. "Elena, this is exactly what we're talking about. You're constructing elaborate narratives to support beliefs that don't align with documented reality. Marcus has provided extensive evidence of his development work stretching back years. Documented reality." The phrase was perfect in its irony. Marcus had indeed documented his version of reality, creating false timelines and backdated business registrations to support his theft. But in a contest between my authentic evidence and his fabricated documentation, the medical establishment was choosing to believe the lies because they came wrapped in professional presentations and corporate letterhead. "Show me this extensive evidence," I challenged, turning to face Marcus directly. "Show me your early prototypes, your development notes, your component purchase records. Show me anything that proves you actually created this technology." Marcus reached for a leather portfolio that had been strategically placed on the coffee table, extracting a stack of professionally bound documents. "These are my preliminary design concepts, dating back to my college years. As you can see, the basic framework for the neural interface system was already established in my early sketches." He handed me a document that looked official and impressive, filled with technical diagrams and engineering specifications that bore a superficial resemblance to my actual work. But as I examined the pages more closely, I realized what I was looking at: my own notebook pages, photocopied and doctored with different dates and Marcus's forged signature. The audacity was breathtaking. He hadn't just stolen my technology. He'd literally stolen my documentation, my hand-drawn sketches, my technical notes, and presented them as his own work with crude alterations to the dating and attribution. Every diagram I'd created during long nights of innovation had been transformed into evidence of his fictional development timeline. "These are my drawings," I said, pointing to specific technical details that I remembered creating. "You've photocopied my notebook pages and changed the dates." Dr. Whitman's expression shifted from clinical concern to something approaching alarm. "Elena, what you're describing sounds like paranoid ideation. The belief that others are stealing or copying your work is a common symptom of certain psychological conditions. Paranoid ideation. Even when confronted with obvious evidence of document forgery, my psychiatric history was being used to dismiss my credibility. Marcus had created a perfect trap. Any evidence I presented would be interpreted as symptoms of mental illness, while his fabricated documentation would be accepted as legitimate because it came endorsed by concerned family members. "Look at the handwriting," I insisted, holding up one of the forged pages. "Compare the technical annotations to Marcus's actual handwriting on his college transcripts. The drawing style, the engineering notation, even the specific terminology, it's all identical to my work." But I could see in their faces that my protests were only reinforcing their preconceived beliefs about my mental state. The more evidence I presented, the more obsessive and delusional I appeared to observers who'd already decided that Marcus was the victim of his sister's psychological breakdown. Mom finally spoke, her voice heavy with the weight of maternal disappointment. "Elena, honey, we love you, but these accusations are tearing our family apart. Marcus is willing to help you get the treatment you need, even though you've been attacking his reputation and his business. Marcus is willing to help. The ultimate manipulation, positioning himself as the generous victim, offering assistance to the troubled sister who'd been making false accusations against him. He'd transformed intellectual property theft into an act of charity, reframing his crimes as evidence of his character." "What kind of treatment?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Dr. Whitman consulted her notes with theatrical precision. "I'm recommending a voluntary 72-hour psychiatric evaluation. It would give us time to adjust your medication and help you work through these delusions about stolen intellectual property. Voluntary 72-hour evaluation." The phrase carried the weight of legal authority disguised as medical recommendation. If I refused, they could petition for involuntary commitment based on my supposed danger to myself or others. If I agreed, I'd be locked away in a psychiatric facility while Marcus solidified his theft and destroyed any remaining evidence of my ownership. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing closer as I realized the scope of the trap Marcus had constructed. He hadn't just stolen my technology, he'd stolen my family, my credibility, and now my freedom. Every person in this room believed his lies more than my documented truth, choosing his polished deception over my authentic evidence. But as I looked around the circle of concerned faces, I noticed something that gave me hope. Carmen's expression wasn't matching the others. Instead of worried agreement, she looked conflicted, even guilty. She knew about the evidence we'd discovered, the college transcripts and financial aid letters that demolished Marcus's timeline. The war for my intellectual property and my sanity had reached its climax, and the next few minutes would determine whether truth could survive in a world where lies came dressed in professional credentials and family concern. The decision to fight back came not from rage, but from the cold clarity that military service had taught me to recognize in moments of mortal danger. As I sat in that circle of concerned faces, watching my own family orchestrate my destruction with the efficiency of a special operations mission, something crystallized in my mind with the precision of a sniper's scope finding its target. They expected surrender, anticipated my collapse under the weight of their coordinated assault on my credibility and freedom. Instead, I gave them something Marcus hadn't planned for: strategic silence. "I need a moment to process this," I said, standing slowly and moving toward the hallway bathroom with the measured pace of someone maintaining control despite overwhelming pressure. The decision about psychiatric evaluation shouldn't be made hastily. Dr. Whitman nodded approvingly, interpreting my request as evidence of rational thinking rather than tactical maneuvering. Of course, Elena. Take all the time you need. This is an important decision for your health and well-being. The bathroom provided the privacy I needed to execute the plan that had been forming in my mind since discovering Carmen's evidence. I pulled out my phone and opened the encrypted messaging app I downloaded weeks earlier, during the paranoid phase of my ordeal that had turned out to be entirely justified. My fingers moved quickly across the screen, typing a message to the one person who might be able to help me escape this trap. David, this is Elena Martinez. I need immediate legal representation. Family attempting involuntary psychiatric commitment to prevent intellectual property lawsuit. Have documentation proving fraud. Can you meet me tonight? Emergency situation. David Ramos had been recommended by my veteran support group, a former military lawyer who specialized in cases involving disabled veterans and civil rights violations. I'd contacted him 2 weeks earlier but hadn't retained his services due to my frozen bank accounts. Now those financial restrictions seemed insignificant compared to the prospect of being locked in a psychiatric facility while Marcus consolidated his theft. The response came within minutes. Meet me at Desert Legal Aid, 2847 Central Avenue in 1 hour. Bring all documentation. Don't go home alone. Don't go home alone. The warning suggested that David understood the gravity of my situation, the possibility that this intervention was just the beginning of more aggressive moves to neutralize my ability to challenge Marcus's fraud. I deleted the message thread and returned to the living room, where my family waited with the patient expectation of people who believed they'd already won. I've made my decision, I announced, taking my seat and meeting each pair of eyes with the steady gaze I'd used when briefing superior officers in combat zones. I'm not agreeing to psychiatric evaluation without independent legal counsel reviewing the basis for this recommendation. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the practiced concern giving way to something sharper and more calculating. Dr. Whitman's pen stopped moving across her notepad, suspended in midair like a weapon that had suddenly jammed. Elena, this isn't a legal matter, Mom said, her voice carrying the patient tone reserved for unreasonable children. This is about your health, your well-being. We're trying to help you. If this isn't a legal matter, then you won't object to me consulting with an attorney before making such a significant decision about my medical care, I replied, standing and collecting my purse with deliberate calm. I'll be in touch within 72 hours with my response. 72 hours. I was using their own timeline against them, buying myself the same amount of time they'd planned to use for my involuntary incarceration. The irony was satisfying in a way that felt dangerous. Emotion could be my enemy in the careful game I was now playing. Marcus stood as well, his movement quick enough to suggest panic beneath his composed facade. Elena, you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. We're family. We can work through this together. Family doesn't steal from family, I said quietly, the words carrying across the room with the weight of absolute certainty. Family doesn't forge documents or manipulate psychiatric evaluations to cover up intellectual property theft. Dr. Whitman's clipboard clattered to the floor as she fumbled to retrieve it, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. For the first time since this nightmare began, I'd managed to shake their confidence, to introduce doubt into their carefully orchestrated narrative about my mental instability. Carmen chose that moment to break ranks, her voice cutting through the tension with unexpected clarity. Elena's right about the legal consultation. If Marcus's documentation is legitimate, then independent review should support that conclusion. The look Marcus shot at Carmen could have melted steel, but she'd already committed to her position. Our youngest sister had always been the family diplomat, but diplomacy required honesty as its foundation, and she'd seen too much evidence of Marcus's deception to maintain the facade of neutral concern. I walked toward the front door with measured steps, hyper-aware that any sign of haste would be interpreted as flight behavior, more evidence of my deteriorating mental state. Behind me, I could hear urgent whispers, the kind of rapid consultation that occurs when carefully laid plans begin to unravel. "Elena, wait," Dad called out, his construction worker's voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to resolving conflicts through direct communication. "Let's talk about this reasonably. You don't need lawyers and legal complications." I turned at the threshold, one hand on the doorknob, and my escape route secured. "Dad, Marcus stole technology I developed over 2 years. He's used forged documents and false psychiatric evaluations to steal my life's work. If that doesn't require legal intervention, then the legal system has no purpose." The drive to Desert Legal Aid felt like traveling through enemy territory. Every red light, a potential ambush point where Marcus could intercept me with additional family members or medical professionals. But the city cooperated with my escape, traffic flowing smoothly through the Phoenix evening, as if the universe had finally decided to level the playing field. David Ramos was waiting in the parking lot when I arrived, a tall man with graying temples, and the kind of steady presence that suggested extensive experience with crisis situations. His handshake was firm without being performative, his eyes assessing my condition with professional discretion rather than clinical judgment. "Ms. Martinez, let's go inside and review what you've brought me. Based on your message, we don't have much time to build a defense." Defense. The word implied that we were already in combat, that the legal battle had begun whether I was ready or not. But as I followed David into the building, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks, the presence of an ally who understood that justice sometimes required warfare. The federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix rose from the desert landscape like a monument to institutional authority, its modern glass and steel facade reflecting the morning sun in ways that made the building appear to glow with righteous purpose. I stood on the steps beside David Ramos, my lawyer's briefcase heavy with 18 months of documented evidence, watching news vans position themselves for optimal camera angles. The media attention had been David's idea. Intellectual property theft combined with veteran exploitation made for compelling headlines that would be difficult for Marcus to spin in his favor. 3 weeks had passed since our emergency meeting at Desert Legal Aid, 72 hours that had stretched into the most intensive legal preparation of my life. David had worked with the efficiency of someone accustomed to fighting battles against opponents with superior resources, building our case with military precision, while simultaneously defending against Marcus's attempts to have me committed for psychiatric evaluation. The competency hearing had been postponed pending resolution of the intellectual property dispute, buying us time to assemble the evidence that would either vindicate my claims or confirm my family's worst fears about my mental state. "Remember," David said, adjusting his tie with practiced confidence, "today is about presenting facts, not emotions. Let the evidence speak for itself. And don't let Marcus's attorney bait you into appearing unstable or vindictive." Marcus's attorney turned out to be Catherine Chen, a corporate litigator from one of Phoenix's most prestigious law firms, whose hourly rate probably exceeded my monthly disability benefits. Her presence at the preliminary hearing suggested that Marcus's venture capital backing included legal insurance, the kind of professional representation that comes with successful business partnerships. She stood near the courthouse entrance in an impeccably tailored suit, consulting her phone with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to winning cases through superior preparation and unlimited budgets. The hearing room was smaller than I'd expected, more like a conference room than the grand courtroom dramas I'd seen in movies. Judge Harrison Martinez, no relation despite the shared surname, reviewed documents with the methodical attention of someone who'd spent decades parsing through competing claims about truth and falsehood. His expression remained neutral as our legal teams presented their opening arguments, but I caught him studying my prosthetic leg with the kind of respectful acknowledgement that suggested personal understanding of sacrifice and service. Catherine Chen spoke first, her voice carrying the polished confidence of someone who'd never doubted her version of reality. "Your Honor, this case represents a tragic example of how untreated PTSD can manifest in elaborate delusions about intellectual property ownership. Mr. Marcus Martinez has provided extensive documentation of his prosthetics development work stretching back to his college years, while Ms. Elena Martinez has constructed an alternative timeline based on recently fabricated evidence." Recently fabricated evidence. The phrase hit my nervous system like incoming artillery, flooding my bloodstream with the hypervigilance that had kept me alive in Afghanistan but now felt like poison in civilian courtrooms. Marcus's legal team had apparently decided that aggressive offense was their best defense, attacking not just my credibility but my fundamental grasp on reality. David rose to respond, his movement deliberate and confident. Your Honor, we will demonstrate that Mr. Marcus Martinez systematically stole his sister's intellectual property through identity fraud, document forgery, and exploitation of her veteran status. The evidence will show that every aspect of his claimed development timeline is fabricated, while Ms. Elena Martinez's ownership can be proven through contemporary documentation, expert testimony, and forensic analysis of the disputed technology. Forensic analysis. The phrase carried the weight of scientific authority, suggesting that truth could be determined through objective examination, rather than competing narratives about family dynamics and mental health. David had arranged for independent analysis of the prosthetic components, bringing in experts who could testify about manufacturing techniques, coding structures, and design evolution that would be impossible to fake or backdate. Marcus himself sat at the defendant's table in his best approximation of wounded dignity, wearing a Navy suit that suggested successful entrepreneurship rather than systematic fraud. His expression radiated the kind of sincere confusion that came from extensive practice in front of bathroom mirrors, the look of someone who couldn't understand why his troubled sister was making such destructive accusations against her loving family. But it was the presence of my parents in the gallery that hit hardest, their faces showing the strain of watching their children destroy each other in public view. Mom clutched Dad's hand with the desperate grip of someone trying to anchor herself against forces she couldn't understand or control. They'd come to support Marcus, believing his version of reality over mine, but I could see doubt beginning to creep into their expressions as David methodically presented our evidence. The first breakthrough came when David introduced Carmen's discovery of Marcus's college transcripts, the academic records that demolished his claims about developing prosthetics technology during his university years. Catherine Chen objected to the relevance of decade-old coursework, but Judge Martinez allowed the evidence, recognizing its importance in establishing timeline credibility. Mr. Marcus Martinez, David continued, withdrew from Introduction to Biomedical Engineering after 2 weeks, citing the course as too technical for career goals. Yet he now claims to have developed revolutionary neural interface technology that requires advanced understanding of biomechanical engineering principles. The courtroom murmur suggested that spectators understood the significance of this contradiction. Marcus's expression flickered with something that might have been panic before settling back into practiced innocence, but the damage was visible to anyone paying attention. David's presentation continued with methodical precision, introducing my original notebook sketches, component purchase records, and bank statements that proved continuous development work over 2 years. Each piece of evidence was date-stamped, verified, and cross-referenced, with other documentation that established an unbroken chain of innovation leading to the disputed prosthetic design. But the devastating blow came when David introduced the forensic analysis of Marcus's supposedly original design documents. Dr. Sarah Kim, a forensic document examiner from Arizona State University, testified that the papers showed clear evidence of digital manipulation, photocopied originals with altered dates, forged signatures overlaid on authentic technical drawings, and metadata that proved recent creation despite claimed historical dating. In my professional opinion, Dr. Kim stated, these documents were created within the last 6 months using sophisticated image editing software. The underlying technical drawings are authentic and consistent with engineering notation from the original author, but the attribution and dating have been falsified. Catherine Chen's cross-examination attempted to discredit the forensic analysis, suggesting that digital manipulation could work both ways, that my evidence might be equally suspect. But Dr. Kim's methodology was unassailable, her testimony backed by peer-reviewed techniques and university credentials that carried more weight than corporate legal rhetoric. The moment when Marcus's fabricated timeline collapsed completely came during his own testimony, when David asked him to explain specific technical aspects of the neural interface programming. Marcus attempted to deflect with generalities about team development and collaborative innovation, but his inability to answer basic questions about code structure and algorithm design became painfully obvious to everyone in the courtroom. Mr. Martinez, David pressed, Can you explain how the pressure sensitivity algorithms interface with the neural signal processing modules? The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Marcus finally admitted, I focused more on the business development side. The technical details were handled by our engineering team. Even in defeat, he couldn't acknowledge that the engineering team consisted of one person, his sister, working alone in a garage workshop, while he planned the theft that would transform her innovation into his empire. Judge Martinez's verdict came with the weight of absolute authority. The evidence clearly demonstrates that the disputed prosthetic technology was developed by Ms. Elena Martinez over a period of 2 years, as documented through contemporary records, expert testimony, and forensic analysis. Mr. Marcus Martinez's claims of ownership are not supported by credible evidence and appear to constitute intentional fraud. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and camera clicks, but I barely heard the commotion. For the first time in months, I could breathe without the crushing weight of gaslighting and manipulation pressing against my chest. Truth had survived its collision with elaborate lies. Justice had proven stronger than family manipulation, and my life's work was finally, officially, mine again. The silence in my garage workshop felt different now, not the oppressive weight of isolation, but the peaceful quiet of victory earned through persistence, rather than vengeance. 6 months had passed since Judge Martinez's verdict. 6 months of watching Marcus's carefully constructed empire crumble, with the methodical precision of a controlled demolition. The prosthetic prototype still sat on my workbench, its titanium components gleaming under fluorescent lights, but now it represented vindication rather than stolen dreams. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the dust motes floating in the air, tiny particles dancing in golden shafts that reminded me of desert sunrises in Afghanistan. But unlike those military dawns that brought the possibility of incoming fire, this sunrise carried only the promise of productive work ahead. My notebook lay open beside the prototype, filled with new sketches for improvements that had emerged during the legal battle, innovations born from the pressure of proving my expertise to skeptical observers. The phone call from Dr. Michael Stevens at the Veterans Administration Research Center had come the previous week, his voice carrying the kind of respectful enthusiasm that I'd forgotten could exist in professional conversations. Ms. Martinez, we've been following your case through the media coverage. The VA is very interested in discussing potential collaboration on bringing your prosthetic technology to market for veteran patients. Potential collaboration. The phrase represented everything I'd originally hoped to achieve: the opportunity to help fellow veterans through innovation, rather than watching someone else profit from my stolen work. Dr. Stevens had explained that the VA's research budget included funding for exactly the kind of neural interface technology I'd developed, support that could transform my garage workshop into a legitimate manufacturing operation. But success felt strange after months of fighting for basic recognition of my competence and sanity. The news coverage following the court decision had been uniformly supportive, portraying me as a heroic veteran who'd overcome family betrayal through determination and legal persistence. Yet reading these articles felt like learning about someone else's life, as if the Elena Martinez they described was a fictional character rather than the exhausted woman sitting in her garage workshop at sunrise. Marcus had disappeared from public view entirely, his social media accounts deleted, and his business ventures dissolved under the weight of fraud allegations. The venture capital firms that had invested in his stolen technology had demanded full refunds, threatening additional lawsuits when they discovered the scope of his deception. Catherine Chen, his expensive attorney, had apparently dropped him as a client once the forensic evidence made his guilt undeniable. Carmen had called 3 times in the past week, her messages increasingly urgent as she tried to schedule a family reconciliation meeting. Elena, we need to talk about moving forward as a family. Mom and Dad are devastated about what Marcus did and they want to make things right between us. Moving forward as a family. The concept felt foreign now, like trying to return to a house that had been demolished and rebuilt with different materials. The people who'd questioned my sanity, supported my commitment to psychiatric evaluation, and enabled Marcus's theft were now eager to celebrate my vindication, as if their betrayal had been a minor misunderstanding rather than attempted destruction of my life. Dr. Whitman had submitted a formal retraction of her psychiatric evaluation, acknowledging in professional language that her assessment had been based on incomplete and potentially misleading information provided by concerned family members. The document was carefully worded to avoid liability while admitting that she'd been manipulated into weaponizing my mental health history against my credibility. But retractions couldn't undo the damage of those weeks when everyone I trusted had chosen to believe elaborate lies over documented truth. The scars from that betrayal ran deeper than my physical wounds from Afghanistan, reaching into the fundamental assumptions about loyalty and family that had sustained me through military service and civilian recovery. My bank account had been unfrozen within days of the court decision, releasing funds that had been held hostage during Marcus's campaign to declare me mentally incompetent. The balance was smaller than I'd remembered, reduced by legal fees and months of restricted access, but it represented something more valuable than money: the restoration of my right to exist as a functional adult in society. The garage workshop had evolved during the legal battle, transformed from a sanctuary for innovation into a command center for document preparation and evidence organization. File cabinets now lined one wall, filled with copies of every piece of documentation that had proven my ownership of the prosthetic technology. I'd learned to treat my own life like a patent application, meticulously documented and legally protected against future theft. A knock on the garage door interrupted my morning routine, the sound causing my shoulders to tense with the hypervigilance that remained from months of expecting attacks. But the figure silhouetted against the morning light was David Ramos, my attorney, carrying a manila envelope that suggested important news rather than additional legal complications. "Elena, I have something you need to see," he said, stepping into the workshop and surveying the organized chaos of components and documentation. "The Patent Office has completed their review of your applications. All 3 patents have been approved, with you listed as the sole inventor. All 3 patents were approved." The words carried the weight of absolute vindication, official recognition that my innovations belonged to me, regardless of family manipulation or corporate theft. David handed me the envelope containing patent certificates that bore my name in bold lettering, documents that couldn't be forged or backdated or manipulated by people who confused charm with competence. "There's more," David continued, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd watched justice triumph over elaborate deception. "The FBI has opened a federal investigation into Marcus's activities. Document forgery, identity fraud, attempted financial exploitation of a disabled veteran. These are serious federal crimes that carry significant penalties." Federal investigation. Marcus's theft had escalated beyond civil litigation into criminal prosecution, the kind of systematic fraud that attracted federal attention when it involved exploitation of veterans and falsification of government documents. The boy who'd charmed his way out of childhood consequences was about to discover that adult legal systems were less susceptible to manipulation. But as I stood in my garage workshop holding patents that proved my innovation and vindicated my sanity, I realized that the most important victory wasn't legal or financial. It was the quiet confidence that came from surviving systematic gaslighting without losing my grip on reality, the knowledge that truth was stronger than even the most sophisticated lies when defended with sufficient persistence and courage. The war for my intellectual property and my identity was finally over, won not through revenge, but through the patient accumulation of evidence and the stubborn refusal to surrender my right to exist as a credible human being. Sometimes justice doesn't look like dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it looks like sitting in your own workspace, surrounded by your own innovations, knowing that no one can ever steal your competence or your worth again. The morning sun climbed higher, and somewhere across the city, federal investigators were probably reviewing boxes of evidence that would ensure Marcus faced consequences for his crimes. But in my garage workshop, surrounded by the tools and components of my life's work, I felt something more valuable than vindication. I felt peace. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, exactly 1 year after Marcus's television interview that had started this nightmare. The return address bore the seal of the White House, and my hands trembled as I opened the heavy cream envelope. Inside was an invitation to the National Veterans Innovation Summit, where I would be recognized for my contributions to adaptive prosthetics technology. 3 months later, I stood on a stage in Washington, D.C., holding the Presidential Award for Veteran Innovation while cameras captured the moment for history. The prosthetic that had nearly destroyed my family was now helping hundreds of veterans across the country, manufactured through a partnership between the VA and a company I'd founded called Liberation Technologies, the name Marcus had stolen but I'd reclaimed. During my acceptance speech, I spotted a familiar face in the audience. Carmen sat in the third row, tears streaming down her cheeks, applauding with the fierce pride of someone who'd chosen truth over comfort. She'd testified in the federal trial that sent Marcus to prison for 18 months, finally understanding that protecting family sometimes meant exposing their crimes. My parents never came to the ceremony. Some bridges, once burned by betrayal, can't be rebuilt with apologies or time. But that night, as I held the award that represented not just my innovation but my survival, I realized I'd gained something more valuable than family approval. I'd gained the unshakable knowledge of my own worth. The prosthetic industry now knows my name, my patents protect innovations that will help veterans for decades, and Marcus learned that charm can't overcome federal fraud charges. Justice didn't look like revenge. It looked like a quiet revolution that changed lives, while the guilty faced consequences for their choices. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and defending your truth? Have you survived betrayal that made you question your own sanity? Share your story in the comments below. I read everyone. And if you believe in fighting for justice, even when it costs everything, subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the darkest moments. Sometimes the most powerful victories happen when we refuse to let others define our reality.